C'est pour nous un grand honneur d'accueillir Madame Castor parmi nous.
Very pleased to have Madame Castor with us today. You know that for quite a while now, Haiti has had a history of very rich intellectual life. Unfortunately, many of the intellectuals from Haiti live elsewhere and work in foreign countries, whether it's Canada, Mexico, the United States, or France. They leave Haiti. And often the research people from Haiti leave and work in foreign countries. Now, Madame Castor began her work abroad. She did her MA and her doctorate in Mexico. And then she was exiled during the Duvalier dictatorship. But then she returned to Haiti, and she stayed in Haiti. First of all, because she loves this country, and secondly, because it's a wonderful place, and of course she has a very strong sense of solidarity with her other citizens of Haiti. Now, as you know, this year for us is our 40th birthday, 40th anniversary, and we wanted to get together in Ottawa with about 10 different personalities with some very, very, very specialized knowledge coming from all over the world. And our first thought was to turn to Madame Castor. We were lucky to be associated to her work. And her reputation and the importance of her work goes way beyond the small area of interest for us. As you know, she is the founder of a very important magazine called Rencontre. And she, of course, has a very important role at the Social Development and Research Center. She has and we call it crass-fed because we can't remember all those names, all those words. Now, today she's going to talk to you about the historical roots of the difficulties of building a nation that was difficult. And since 1804, don't forget. And I love history, and studying countries is impossible to do without studying the history of a country. So we believe that Madame Castor has chosen this subject, and it is very happy. We're very happy about this. She's going to be talking for about a half an hour, and then, of course, she'd like to hear what you have to think and what you have to say, and she'll, of course, answer any of your questions. So, I don't want to waste any more time. So, Suzy, you've got the mic, and thanks for coming today. Thank you once again for this wonderful invitation. And of course, this is an institution that's been around for quite a while. And it's quite an honor for me to have been invited and to be able to speak to you today. I must say that I saw Mila Moroney today and a few other friends, and I'm always surprised to see how interested people are in Haiti. And this interest is so great that David Maloney gave me this book, and I think that it's a very interesting book for us. It's about the situation in Haiti, and goes from 1980 to 1997. We don't have a lot of things written about that period in Haiti's history, and every book does reveal something new to us. And I can see in this room there's some ambassadors who served in Haiti, and every time that I come back to Canada, I'm always surprised to see how important Haiti is to Canadians. Last summer, I was listening to the radio, and they were talking about the attitude of Canadians and the response of Canadians to this earthquake. And it wasn't the same as the catastrophes in Afghanistan. And this touched me. Of course, people can say that Afghanistan is far away and that the Haitian diaspora is very important in Canada, and maybe that sometimes there are years with so many terrible disasters that people are almost immunized against them. However, this really moved me, and I thought about this because I see some paradoxes here. Because, of course, everyone knows that Haiti is very poor, but it is also, at the same time, a country that makes people admire it because of its strong culture, a country that has been rejected, but it's still very attractive for many people. It's a country that is often condemned, denounced in a very firm way, but at the same time, it's a country that makes us think. And it is almost impossible to say that Haiti would leave anyone indifferent. In fact, in the course of our history, there are many things that are misunderstood. We have so many deceptions and so many letdowns, so many ideas that have been aborted, that we don't really have sometimes a lot of answers to these questions. There's a lot of subjectivity when we talk about Haiti and think about it. It's a country that is often considered to be an exception. However, particularities are not necessarily, do not necessarily make it an exception. In fact, the Haitian phenomenon of Haiti is essentially historical mutation, which could have been like other similar processes in other times and other spaces, and things that we find almost everywhere. It's true that in the case of Haiti, the persistence and the length of its crises often lead to lots of contradictions. And we see a lot of characteristics in Haiti and Haitians, depending on the time that we spend looking at it in other societies. Now, if Haiti was one of the first independent countries on the continent, it is also a precursor to the dictatorship that imposed itself in the 60s. And every effort, every attempt to understand a country when it's in difficulties is difficult if you don't put it into a historical perspective. We'll talk about pariahs and saying there's no future here. Now, if we look at Haiti today and say that these facts are isolated and we don't understand its history, it makes it very difficult to understand any continuity or any breaks that there are in Haiti's history. We must look to certain structural factors which formed Haiti and made it an independent country since 1804. I will try today, in a very few minutes, talk to you about 3 centuries of history, so that you can see the various difficulties and the problems that Haiti is facing. Sometimes we say that Haitians always want to turn back to the first page of the universal history of a glorious period. But it's true. There was a victorious page that led to a national project in Haiti. And Haiti and its independence was an event that, in fact, changed and opened new avenues, and it changed, in fact, the course of these people, and it transcends humanity, and we should not forget this. In fact, the revolution in Saint-Domingue at the end of the 18th century was one of those inevitable events that, in fact, marked three continents: Africa, Europe, and the Americas. This is one of the sources for the progress in the United States, Europe, and even Africa was pulled along in this entire process. Now, the operations and the development of this small territory became an imperial frontier, and it became a very flourishing place at the beginning, as we know. But the wealth and the plantation economy, which ensured its wealth and the prosperity of the French middle class, was, of course, based on slavery. We cannot forget that one of the worst stories of exploitation of human beings in the history of the world. And as the wealth increased, this exploitation of humanity became worse and worse and baser and baser. The young Africans who arrived there in slavery had a life expectancy of 7 years after they arrived. Terror, torture, violence, and then, of course, everything. Religion also was used to explain and justify the system in the name of Christian civilization. Despite the contradictions between these principles of the revolution that we find in the revolution in France in 1789 and the rights of man, the middle-class revolutionaries in France were very happy to have slaves in Haiti. And this, of course, the slavery was the source of the liberty that eventually came, and this movement for emancipation, which was very complex, developed, and in fact ended up in a revolt against slavery, against colonialism, and it was a social and racial revolution, and independence was proclaimed in 1804, the first independent republic. Now, the fact that this revolution took place and the Proclamation of Independence put Haiti in the beginning of a large historical movement in the 19th century, which will change the entire region of the Caribbean Sea area, and of Mexico and Central and Latin America. So, the declaration by Haiti promoted declarations of independence elsewhere. Now, this independence of Haiti took place in a racial situation where slavery was paramount, and this led to a reconquest of the area that makes us look backwards. We have to look at the beginning of this and see the difficulties that this new country had. Many, many factors were there. First of all, there was war, and the slaves burned everything, the plantations, the structure, all the factories in Saint-Domingue. Capital fled Italy, along with the knowledge, the experience, administrative techniques, and the technological knowledge. Hygiene, embargoes took place. All of this meant that this new state had many, many difficulties. Furthermore, imagine that they had an army of 50,000 men, and they had to build an entire system of fortifications. Showed us just how much this poor country had to mobilize all of its material and human resources, not only to rebuild the country, but to defend itself in a very difficult environment. However, in 1804, the increase in production was such that the government was able to supply everything that everyone needed. Furthermore, in 1825, things changed. As a price for independence, the government decided to pay a huge debt to France as a fee for chasing the French colonists from the island during the Revolution. And France, which had 25 million people, had a budget of 30 million francs, and Haiti paid back everything it said it owned, but it was a very huge sacrifice. And with this enormous debt begins the debts of Latin America. And that would be the end of this complete independence. And neocolonialism will come back. The payment of this debt means that there was a loss of capital, and it slowed down any accumulation of capital. It stopped any middle-class people in the rural areas, and it was one of the most important obstacles to any development of public policy. In this context, where we had to defend the country, explain its sovereignty, integrate the people, and create a new state, the military power, as we have often seen in Latin America, dominated in the same way as the colonial countries. And a system of domination was set up, which was characterized by a political elite that ran the country. Now, there was quite a difference between the directors and former slaves, which were looking for new institutions. Everybody wanted liberty, equality, and fraternity, like in France, but they all wanted access to citizenship. So for the first 5 decades of the 19th century, this peasant movement was very important, and it constantly pushed the elite, and there were lots of violent eruptions. Now, throughout the 19th century, the objective limitations to keeping the sugar plantations going kept the dominant class, and it meant that coffee became one of the most important pillars of its economic structure, sugar and coffee. And from large plantations, we saw that people were very, very, very rebellious, and the coexistence of two systems that were complementary but opposed, the larger sugar plantations and small coffee plantations, meant that not only did they have to produce food for the people, but we also had to produce things for exports. With the second industrial revolution in the middle of the 19th century and the growth of imperialism, we'll get to a second step. Now, the modernizations that we see at that period were seen in Haiti with bridges, buildings, railroads, electricity, cinema, telephone, automobiles, as well as the reform of the educational and health systems. I'm going to cite, quote, often we said that the 19th century didn't really bring anything. It was like the Middle Ages, a medieval period, and yet it's not true. There was certainly development in the course of the 19th century. And this is true. But there were structural limits which led to other problems. And the result was lands were broken up, fewer exports of coffee, world markets collapsed, flight of capital, and of course the great powers had also neo-colonial ideas. So over the 19th century, this stopped a lot of development. And we see that there was, of course, industrialization, agriculture became important, but it was clear that we needed a political force that could ensure development of progress, development of a nation, development of a society, in fact, the development of an entire country. So polarization, there was a fight for the power between the oligarchs. And of course, foreign countries stuck their noses in this. The rural people wanted social justice and access to property. And there were other politicians who wanted simply to have political power. At the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, was very tumultuous, and the cacao dictatorship was installed, and then serious fighting occurred in the first 10 years of the 20th century. The oligarchs, in fact, were an obstacle to any development, and we can say what would be the result of these fights? This crisis within the oligarchs. Was one sector going to win in order to benefit from its development projects?
Mais justement, le processus.
But the natural process did not work out, because on July 28, 1975, North American Marines occupied our country, and they brought a solution to the crisis. And the crisis, that put an end to the crisis, and of course, but it was part of the history. And as Gaillard said, the white people are coming. Just like other countries in Latin America, it was the loss of independence, and just like everywhere else, they had to adapt all their national structures. With the high prices of sugar on the international market, they wanted to convert the Caribbean countries into a huge industry of sugar, and more particularly in Cuba and the Dominican Republic too. In Haiti, during the first phase of the occupation, the guerrilla went through a North American installation. It happened until 1920, and that led to terrible violence. And despite the massive concessions, all the small properties demanded too much expulsions, and the lack of infrastructure meant many difficulties to the development of the sugarcane industry in Haiti. So the plantations that were in Haiti, up to a certain point, belonged to the local structures, and the capital preferred to develop Haitian workers by sending them to Cuba and to the Dominican Republic. I would like to give you a figure which will help you. In 1930, the investments went up to 200 billion in Cuba, 200 billion in the Dominican Republic, and only 14 million in Haiti. So you could see the difference. Corporations in Haiti that were occupied by the Americans had coffee agriculture, but was not developed. And the occupation did not help Haiti to develop their industries and did not help them to modernize their infrastructures. However, they imposed the modernization of institutions thanks to the tools of democracy with formal elections, and mostly thanks to the presence of a new army, which represented the base of the new system. Furthermore, the development of the middle class and the development of infrastructure meant that the elite were agreeable to this occupation, but there was no real democracy. The oligarchs became a dominant elite. The oligarchs took advantage of the marginalization of the rural areas. They also excessively centralized the beginning of Port-au-Prince, the development of Port-au-Prince. The occupation had exacerbated the structure, and it came to another dimension, meaning the centralization of Port-au-Prince meant that the rural areas became weaker, and there was this antagonism between black people and the mulattoes. The resentment within the black people and the middle class will feel excluded and humiliated by the mulatto powers. But the army with the evolution, was ready to take over the succession. And the system created by the North Americans worked so well that after 10 years of mandate and the powers is transferred in a peaceful way. The representative democracy was also well accommodated with the presidential absolutism, and the elections were dominated by the army. At the end of the war and the collapse of fascism, the post-occupations have to confront a crisis. It's the 1946 movement. It's a democratic movement made out of young people from universities, mostly in Port-au-Prince and a few cities around Port-au-Prince. And the black bourgeoisie wanted democracy. They wanted to legalize unions. They wanted to create political parties. And they also wanted to promote black people, with a few exceptions. There were also radical people, but this general movement does not question the domination, but they want the black people to be included in this state. So this will allow the occupation to develop their basis, and it will reinforce it. The black bourgeoisie used to be mostly made out of mulattoes, and this will allow to satisfy the people who were for democracy with the support of the army. During that time, there was the advantage of the after the war. There was more and more investments, which stimulates the economy, and there's a lot of euphoria in that class. It's the period where there's a democratic government of 1930 until 1956, with the exception of the wartime, and the modernization happens in a lot of industries, whether it be in the urbanization of some provinces, cities such as Belader have better infrastructure. There is an international expo during that time for the foundation of Port-au-Prince, and it was a very important event. There are lots of discussions that are happening on national problems. In Latin America, during the same time, let's not forget, it's the growth of the military power. And it's in the middle of the 1950s that the war in Korea will end. And the Azel cyclone that puts an end to the cycle of prosperity. And at that time, all the contradictions will appear again, and all the old problems will come back, and the new conflicts encouraged the army's ambition. But the favorable situation allowed a modernized system and had masked and hid the deep structural problems and all these structures for the economy. So it was more important than in 1957. What was a development crisis at the beginning of the century appears in 1957 after an illusion, or we can say it, with the illusion of development with all its problems. But since from 1956-1957, we're going into a new phase of crisis. which was the solution of dictatorship. At the beginning of the century, we had the occupation, and then in '57 we had the dictatorship, and then the Duvalier comes in, which is at the end of the occupation. His regime puts in political domination, which was very violent. And as Ralph Trujillo said, the Duvalier system formalized that crisis, and all the democratic systems collapsed, and the regime had its own system. The regime that came out of the occupation, and to keep that system from the occupation, it destroyed everything that was created in the period before. And at that time, there's lots of manipulators and dictators, and that regime claimed to be the spokesperson for the middle class, and he's trying to get more power. No regime could resist by terror. So the Duvalier system includes the middle class, and they falsely include the rural people from the rural areas, and they want to dominate them. But it is very important that during that process, with the heroic fights, Duvalier received the support from the United States that was focused on the Cuban Revolution. In 1968, the country goes through a collapse, and they're starting the development of underdevelopment. And that regression happens at a time where there's a huge modernization in the world, the technological development where first man walked on the moon. There was more justice, more democracy in the world. It's the time where there's Cuban Revolution and the independence of African and Caribbean countries. In 1971, the lifelong presidency goes to Jean-Claude Duvalier, the son. The modernization of repressive methods and the power of the black and mulatto bourgeoisie, and is the one that claims to go through a revolution. After 15 years, there was a bit of development in their economy. We talked about it earlier. The wild capitalism attracted foreign investments, so there was growth in that development. So there were mines in Haiti that were developed, and there's the development of internal markets of food, despite the reduction of the coffee industry and other industries create the illusion of economic development. And hid at that time the collapse of traditional agriculture. More and more people became poor, and they were very poor neighborhoods, and there was a new phenomenon of boat people. So it's really the illusion of modernization during the Duvalier regime. Everything was collapsing, but soon the economic crisis effects and the collapse of the price of coffee meant that the government stability was very fragile, and the limits of the Duvalier government. we could say that the Duvalier government was to try to establish the basis of the oligarchs to dominate the peasants, and they were trying to create a more powerful black and mulatto class with absolute violence. The contradictions become worse by creating a gap between the rich and the poor, by reinforcing the two-tier society which started to be developed since the end of the 19th century. Despite the violence, the army could not ensure the stability. The collapse of the regime coincided with the collapse of other dictatorships. And if the crisis of the end of the 19th century meant that there was a continuity, which was also added to new problems, they tried to look for a solution to have development and democracy. Once again, it was the Haitian elite, and it was their incapacity. They could not create development models. But let's say it. It was also the failure of the political government and also of the other countries that supported that government. When in 1986 Duvalier was overthrown, a new phase started, which is an eternal transition. The Duvalier dictatorship was covered by all the 21st century. So there are three factors. During that process, there are more contradictions that appear from the past. And let's say it. The 1987 Constitution, despite the difficulty to apply it, explains the society project expressed by most of the population in Haiti. The fight against the militaries who inherit the Duvalier system created a lot of mobilization. The military could repress, but they could not repress the movement. There was a very difficult fight. In December 1990, there were elections that happened. It was a victory for the society, and for the first time since the American occupation, the army is no longer the power. The crisis seemed to have been solved, but it was again another illusion, and there was a military coup d'etat in 1991. During that 7 months, there has been no important change, not in the structures and not in people's lives. But beyond that objective reality, there was the feeling of that people could reach sovereignty. That could have happened. That could have created an influence to create a more strong country. After the Cold War, the resistance becomes stronger, and the American troops gives back the power to the president. So there are new illusions and new opportunities, and there are also very bad things that happen. The absence of project from the president affected the legitimacy of the regime, because the government repeated the past problems with abuse of power, corruption, with dominance that we thought was past. It also accentuated the social problems. Taking away the institutionalization took away the opportunities. As I mentioned, from 2006 and 2004 to 2006, it covered their whole transition. Let's not forget it. So we wanted to destroy the Duvalier model, but we cannot succeed in creating a new one. The hybrid model that's taken from the Duvalier system, because there's too many contradictions, and also because of the evolution, and it's because of its history and its maturity that it's very difficult for the development of the country. It's a weak country in its national constructions, but it's a country that has new tools to function. During that time, there was a very important change from 1994. It's the dissolution of the army, which was the basis of the post-occupation system. But what is sure, the country has a hard time to get over their problems. They will not be able to reach democracy without making radical changes. So we have to talk about the politics in the transition that we're going through. During that time, I don't have much time left, so I want to talk very quickly. The economy did not make any progress, and there are other factors. Never during the transition, the country is being supported by bilateral, multilateral development. There's also a lot of corruption, drugs, and there's a new reality that's happening, is that this country is not producing anything. And there's a growth in the population, and the consumption level is growing too. So there will be the rural areas will be affected. There will be immigration, wild urbanization. The industrial sector is weakening, and the informal industry is very dominant in the system. The economic disintegration is happening too, and it's also benefiting only the protégés of the elite. Every day, people's lives are affected and is weakening. There are huge changes that happen despite that. Let's say there's state terrorism that is happening, that was happening, but it is slowly disappearing. There are still isolated incidents that are happening. Also, there was the conquest for free expression. There were collective demands. So the population is becoming more and more demanding and more aware of what is happening. What we neglect is the role of the émigré, of people that are leaving the country. And what is also strange, there is people in rural areas have access to the radio. During the transition, many invisible stakeholders are there in the rural areas and in the other provinces are appearing to demand new things. There are new, very poor areas that appear during the Duvalier system, and the middle class that are going against the system. Even now, these classes cannot perceive the deep changes that are happening because the excluded people are asking for participation, and for the first time they want social inclusion but also political inclusion. And it's not for nothing that the main demands that are expressed, despite the fact that it's used in a very awkward and confused way, is all that is asking for the right for citizenship for all, and with clear rules to politics, and a new institution that will allow a national project and will foster the participation of all classes. So in this transition, the domination and repressive and violent methods of the government, all this is becoming less efficient. Their political regime is weakening and cannot meet the needs of all these people. They need to maintain the legitimacy of their government. But there's progression, but there's also regression. They have a weak organization because there is no organized political party and there's no structured civil society. And they still cannot solve the economic and political problems. So the polarization is exacerbated by this transition, so there are huge confrontations and contradictions. And among all this problem, we have the national decisions. The international factor has a lot of influence, and the notion of a sovereignty is disappearing. And when I say this, we have to make a distinction between a collaboration and the reality of a country that depends on 60% of international help.
And if we talk about sovereignty, and the word, it's not a good word, we have to find another one. And this explains, to a large extent, the determination to deal with this foreign aid. From 1890 to 1994, we had 10 interventions of military troops. And independence has thus become very problematic. Foreign interventions are too numerous. I'm making a difference between 2004 and when minister came in and real interventions as it was done in 1915. Not the same thing. I never confused the two, real military intervention and not. This presence conditions everyone in Haiti, and it also guides our midterm future. And this is a supranational presence in Cuba. In this panorama, we now see an earthquake. This was considered to be one of the largest natural disasters in the history of the world. If you look at the territory where this phenomenon happened, it's incomparable with the tsunami, of course. It went halfway around the world. This was all concentrated in one place. It was a disaster. Material losses, psychological losses. And I think this will be a new phase in the history of Haiti. During this earthquake, we saw the incredible capacity of the Haitian people to confront disaster and chaos. Its determination was even greater than before. The Haitian diaspora was present for the population of Haiti. The assistance and the sympathy of the entire world were incredible, and this traumatic event will lead to a new dynamic in Haiti, and we can already see that light has been shone on these contradictions, and we now have new challenges, but we now see the incredible potential and the opportunities, the resources, and the levers that will be necessary to refound and reconstruct this country. And all of this is essential. I would like to talk about some aspects that will transform this country. If the damage goes way beyond what you can do with a magic wand, it's also true that 9 months after the earthquake, the president and his executive were back in power, but there was no vision. We needed real participation. We needed to be aware of the suffering of the people. And thus, it was clear that they were completely disorganized as a state, and they had no capacity to have compassion and sympathy for its people. And it was a terrible situation. The precarious life of Haitians got worse, even when emergency aid came in. And of course, the foreign aid was welcome. I don't know if anybody here ever went to Haiti to see what it's like to live in a tent with a burning sun close by. This is an incredible sight to see. And life is precarious. Very difficult health conditions and hygiene conditions. Don't forget, when we talk about the effects, we talk about the poor people, but there was a very wealthy class which profits from all this. But there's also a working, lower middle class, hard-working people, and now they've got no capital left at all. There is no more middle class in Haiti. The middle class can no longer exist in Haiti. And these camps of the victims are like time bombs ready to go off. And the people are more and more frustrated every day. There's no strategy for survival. Nobody has the way, any means to become middle class, and everyone feels they've been abandoned by the state. And I think that there is the potential of an incredible revolt. And we don't know when it will happen, but it might happen. It's like a time bomb ready to go off. I would like to. There will also be short-term effects when it's time to go back to school. And we're also in the hurricane period. Just a week ago, last Thursday, there were very strong winds in Haiti and even more damage, but even more psychological damage for Haitians. The people know that the hurricane season can come upon, a hurricane can come on them and cause a loss of complete control of everything. Now, not only is the state very fragile, not only has the government kind of given up, the international role is even more important with this earthquake. Foreign aid is present, omnipresent, and we often say that it's the government that decides and that you have to participate in the government, but we wonder if this is not a phony assistance. And we talked a minute ago about CRDI, will be a lab to look for new ways of putting Haiti into receivership, if you will. At the beginning, there was a certain sympathy when help came in, but we can't even control our own life, our own business. And when Minister came in and there were certain results, and even when the Latin American countries participated in this, we know that now, as time goes by, and as there is no change to the situation at all, we are certain that the social disruption is going to occur. Reconstruction is also a problem. Everybody has his own idea about what reconstruction means. Are we going to rebuild buildings? Are we going to rebuild this? Or do we have to redo the entire foundation of the country? Did this earthquake give us a chance to see new opportunities to progress? Or are we going to continue to do what we did in the past? The status quo would be going back. And one thing is sure, reconstruction is impossible without the participation of the Haitian diaspora, without the international community, without the participation of Haitians too, who must awaken and decide what they want. And the government has an enormous responsibility to ask all Haitians to participate in their future, without which there will be no reconstruction at all. It will be simply putting a little icing sugar on the situation. Nothing will change, and will simply increase the difference between the rich and the poor. And there'll be more Haitians in foreign countries, but the country itself will never come back. And it's this lack of perspective, this lack of vision about reconstruction, that we see in this destabilized environment. We're anticipating a huge emigration. The country will lose its children, its structures, and its brain power. And of course, there's the question of elections. I would like to let everyone else participate in the question and answer period. So I was talking about, yes, I'll finish quickly on these elections, which of course is a source of discordance. Everybody has to get together. The international community would like stability, and the government wants nothing to change. There are illusions on both sides, which can also lead to other problems for Haiti. And on this, I will finish by quoting Anthony Flebs, who says, what will the color be tomorrow? I would say that tomorrow will be the color of hope, because there are many Haitians. There are many friends of Haiti. There are governments. There are a lot of young people. There are a lot of strong women who want to destroy this circle which begins and re-begins all the time since the 19th century. Perpetual re-beginning. We have to break with this in order to progress. And I think that with this determination, first of all, among the Haitians themselves, and with this vision, we will, in fact, be able to solve our problems, which will lead to a break with this unfortunate history and a good future.
Merci infiniment.
Thank you very much for this important analysis. It's very deep and, sad analysis. We have a few people who certainly have some questions. This was televised. We used video to televise the conference. And the first question, this lack of confidence between the government and the people, as well as with the lack of cooperation among the people, is, of course, a break to creating a credible state where there would be real development. Now, what do you think are the means that should be set up to get rid of the Creole adage, and he spoke in Creole, which no one understands? Meanwhile, if there's anybody in the room who would like to ask a question, please go to the mics. We have a mic, one on either side of the room, and we can take a few questions here in the room. If there is a lack of confidence, it does exist for sure, but we can be determined to start dialoguing, not just a dialogue that'll be ordered by somebody else. We have to have a dialogue, not like in the past, but a real dialogue, a dialogue where things will be done, where the population, the people, will participate. This is the only solution. If we want people to participate, we need communications. If we want communications, we need debates. And I think that today, maybe I'm a little too optimistic, but I think there are a lot of circles that are starting to dialogue. People are starting to understand. People are starting to see what the problems are and describing the situation. I think that it is time for us to look at our problems together, our problems of a nation, so that we can build a new nation. Someone in the room, the chap here on my right. Please introduce yourselves when you're at the mic, so we'll know who you are. Jean-Marie Leroy. I am a retired teacher. And I'm following what's going on in Haiti. And when I heard that Madame Castor was going to come, I haven't heard much about her for the past while. And I said that she might be able to enlighten us, or enlighten me, about what I understand about Haiti today. Now, what I saw, and what I always hated, was the negative role of the Republican Port-au-Prince in the problems of the Haitians. And now we see that this province has gone back. Hatred for progress by the Haitian authorities in Port-au-Prince, local governments, the municipalities, the small cities and towns are left alone. This power has just left them alone in a vacuum. And politics has begun all over again. And nobody is interested in development in Haiti. So I'd like to ask Madame Castor, what do you see? We're talking about decentralization. What would this decentralization mean to you? How will it be done? Okay, that's a very good question. Maybe Madame Castor has an answer about what she sees as decentralization. I was talking about the Constitution, and the Constitution is a good point for the people, because this question of decentralization was up in the Constitution, and so far we haven't had any laws, haven't had any bills, but we can have bills about decentralization, but there's no political will to do it. Nobody wants to do decentralization. However, there's something new in Haiti. The provinces in Haiti, and as you talk, the provinces do have rights, and they're demanding their rights. Before the American occupation, there was a lot of hatred between the provinces and the country, people. But avenues are opening up. And legally speaking, laws must be passed to advance the society. Without decentralization, we won't have any real development in Haiti. This is essential despite the current difficulties. There's a person behind the man who just spoke. Pierre Jacquesville. I would like to ask Madame Castor how she would, what she thinks of the reconstruction plan of the government and of the UN, and with the CRH Reconstruction Committee under Mr. Clinton and the Prime Minister. Are they going to just have another oligarchic structure? There are many projects, actually, for the UN. But there's no vision. And that's the big drama right now in Haiti. No vision. The UN, despite the presence of Mr. Clinton, and despite the fact that a committee was set up, this committee There are wonderful names from international people, but on the level of Haiti itself, it's a very banal thing. Because there's no abilities here. And as I said before, this committee has projects but no vision. And this committee is very important, as Mr. Clinton understands. He's not a Haitian, but he's put his weight behind the committee. And don't forget that Mr. Clinton is the husband of Hillary Clinton, so there are some heavyweights on the side of this committee. And do they really understand the situation in Haiti? Well, all of this leads to certain questions. A lot of plans, as I said, but these are certainly projects. But there is no real, authentic population by the Haitian people. And nobody's even thinking about decentralization when they talk about rebuilding Port-au-Prince. That can't be done without decentralization, because we'll simply redo the exact same thing we had before with all its problems. So we need a vision of this development if we're going to be able to do anything. And it's only the state and the government that has the power to really allow anything to progress with a real vision. Thank you.
Beaucoup à faire à Haïti pour l'Organisation des États américains comme pour le Canada. David.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Castor.
Thank you very much, Madame Castor. It's a real pleasure to see you here today and to listen to what you had to say. Near the end of your wonderful presentation, you were talking about the risks of conflicts, the possibility of conflicts, and you said that the elections will be, of course, playing out in this environment. You, of course, talked about hope. Now, could you talk to us a bit about what is necessary for these elections to really be hopeful this time? Hopeful to change things and help Haiti to go forward. Thank you. I'll ask the two people at the mics now to ask their questions, and Madame Castor will come back to answer all three at the same time. Madame, and then the chap to my left. Thank you. Violet Manukium. I'm a specialist in participatory development. I was in Haiti when they were setting out the strategy to reduce poverty, to present it to the International Monetary Fund, and I had just arrived from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where I worked as an analyst of poverty, working with 35,000 poor people, and I had all the tools needed in French. I had manuals, I had guides on how to work with people who are illiterate, and I offered all of this to the government of Haiti, all of these things. I knew that they had to work on things like this. They smiled very nicely. They had big nods and smiles. But I think that they did nothing with this. I feel it. There was no passion. And, of course, there's a question of, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there was not much money. There was a bit of money to do this exercise I did in Congo. But nobody gave any money to Haiti. The world, maybe the bank has money, but they didn't ask for it. And they didn't ask me to come back. Because I offered to follow up on what I offered and to do an evaluation of their strategy among the people. They never asked me to come back. I mean, what can I judge here? These are people who, they hold power in Haiti, and they have no vision. They don't even want to do anything about participatory development. What can we do with these people? Not too long, please. We're running out of time. Thank you very much. Jive Michel. I'm a professional with one foot in Haiti, 1 foot in Canada. I listened to Madame Castor's presentation with great interest, and I would like to hear her answer to this participatory business. But despite her presentation, despite all of its quality, I think that there's something that's unclear or wasn't said. Today, in Haiti, there are a lot of NGOs, and this is a very important player, these NGOs. We cannot neglect their role in Haiti. I would like to hear what Madame Castor thinks about the presence of the NGOs and their role. And one last intervention, perhaps? Thank you, Madame Castor, for this brilliant talk. And thank you for explaining the 300 years of Haiti's history for us. I work for an NGO which is working in Haiti with participatory democracy. I have a question for you. The factors that you mentioned, which will allow us to get through this crisis and this transition, should probably lead, you would like it to lead to a break with the past, a real rupture. This is already a done deal. This is an external break which came about through the earthquake. Now, all of this must come together if we're going to channel the important forces in Haiti. What do you think will be the factors that will allow us to get together again and survive this crisis? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Suzy, your turn. I would like to tell Mr. Lee that I was very pleased to be here. Now, listening to you, I understand how many people here, or people in the Haitian diaspora, or people who have 1 foot in each country. All of you have worked, all of you have thought about proposals. And you also had illusions. And as the lady said, nothing happened. She had her illusions, and she tried to help. And as I said before, there is no will, no political will in Haiti to do anything. In Haiti, we can have solutions, if you will. We have to take care of our business.
But for development, we need that help. But coming back to elections, as we said earlier, there will be elections because there's a coalition between the government and the international community. There are technical difficulties to that. We need to overcome those difficulties. some technical aspects are so difficult to overcome. But as Mr. Miller said, even if the elections are bad, there are still elections happening. So this is just to give you an idea of the perspectives of the future. What we needed to do from the beginning with respect to the population, there was a rejection. People were wary. The government refused to make small changes. And so the population was not very happy about that. That's the minimum they were asking for. There has been a history of elections that never happened because the power was in a situation where the elections that were going to happen before the earthquake, now someone said it, because of the earthquake, it was the opportunity to think about something else, to have a new vision. It was the opportunity to have a new start with those elections. But instead of that, not only did we not consult the population, but there were also more illusions. There has been positions from that CEP that were very malicious. That's the least I can say. I would like to give you a simple example. There has been parliamentary elections for members of parliament and senators, and it was supposed to happen in November. You know, it has been a while since the earthquake happened, and no election had happened. People died. People were displaced. There has been a huge change within the society. The CEP pretended to be democratic. They wanted to say that all parties participated. Instead of that, they decided not to enroll MPs and senators. They decided to keep the who was enrolled in November. I think that they're despising people. But the international community accepts that. And that's where the problem exists. The problem is that we need to have elections. We all agree with that. But we need to have good elections. But in the name of stability, the community accepts everything, even bad elections. So you need to understand this. But the reality is that these elections will ensure that there's a continuity, even with the problems, and with all the consequences that could happen. When you ask the question about what we need to do now, I think it's just like a train that left, and it's very difficult to stop that train. In a country like ours, a lot of things happen when there's an election, and there's a lot of hope and triumph. But once the election is done, they will confront reality, and the problems will start. On the other hand, the lady asked about development, and thank you for that question. And thank you for doing that work in Haiti. And as I said, people express the fact that despising the system. We need to put a plan into place, but we need to apply 1/4 of a plan. And if that happened, the country would be functioning better. But people despise the power. We always say that Haiti does not have any money, and I'm telling you that it's true. But we do have resources. We have human resources. We have cultural resources. The population is enthusiastic. The population is ready. But because they despise the power does not take advantage of the participation and is not looking for it. The power always turns to foreign countries asking for money, and there are no results. It's a vicious circle. With respect to NGOs, that's a very important question that we're asking ourselves these days. You know, the NGOs are like a language, where you find very good things, but you find the worst things. There are some NGOs and other NGOs. When we talk about NGOs, we think that they're all the same, but it's not true. Some NGOs represent much stronger structures, stronger than the state. And those NGOs have bigger resources, more resources than the department. And often they run in a parallel manner. And the institutions are very important if we want to progress. So that's one category of NGO. But there are other NGOs that often represent governments, that work with governments. In Canada, you have many NGOs that represent Canada. According to their objectives, they can bring something or not. Sometimes they are strong, but sometimes they don't meet the needs of the state structures, and they don't reinforce the work that they do. They need to orient them in the good framework. As I said earlier, when the earthquake happened, since then, there has been many NGOs that arrived in Haiti. And you find all kinds of NGOs. Some of them know Haiti, others not. Except for the humanitarian NGOs that come and don't stay. Other ones come to our country. They don't meet the needs of a better structure. So there are small projects that can give results or no results. But the reality is that those NGOs come to our country as if they're going into the jungle. It's not their fault. But there's no centralized power. So often the provinces cannot function well. For the moment, candidates are busy with the elections. So a lot of people don't understand that the earthquake that represents a break, a lot of people do not understand that break. So when people wake up after the elections, it will be very brutal. Suzy, thank you very much. People are very enthusiastic about your speech. because we have not answered all the questions. Thank you so much for your speech in Ottawa. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you.